Retired four-star admiral, Officer Admiral James Stavridis now, former Supreme Allied Commander at NATO, a senior NBC News international security and diplomacy contributor. Admiral, the U.S. said no to this transfer of Poland's planes to Ukraine, calling it high risk. But at the same time, the Pentagon's provided Stinger missiles and other high-powered weapons to Ukraine. What's the difference?
You know, Shep, I don't see a big difference, frankly. And, I think it's one thing to talk about creating a full-blown no-fly zone over Ukraine. I would not advocate doing that. That's high risk. That's Russians and Americans nose to nose, potentially going to war. But your point, as between providing Stinger missiles, providing additional ground-to-air missiles, and doing this transfer of the MiG-29s, I don't see a big difference. Yeah, there's more risk, but let's face it, process back to the images we just watched. We are at a stage where we need to take more risk to stop the war crimes and the atrocities. Yeah. So from all I see, we ought to move forward on this, figure it out, figure out the logistics. We can do this.
Get them the planes, you're saying. Just get them to them. You know, there was a time Western leaders said canceling Nord Stream 2. No, then they canceled it. Then they said no to banning oil from Russia until they banned it. I mean, is there a bend here somewhere? You listen to the Ukrainian president and your heart just bleeds. He's laying this all on NATO. He goes, our people are dying because you're not helping in the skies.
Yeah, and I think there's a pretty obvious red line here, which is no NATO boots on the ground fighting this war. And I think there's another red line, which is no NATO aircraft in the skies over Ukraine. But take those Polish jets, sign them off to Poland, put Polish symbols on the wings, operate them out of Ukrainian bases. Hey, they're Ukrainian fighters. And I, for one, believe that could help in this situation, alongside the things John Kirby talked about, additional surface-to-air missiles. We need to do both. We're clearly at the point where we need to stop this where we can.
Let's talk chemical weapons. The Pentagon is suggesting that the Russians are indicating, well, the Americans have chemical weapons there in Ukraine, and that's a sign that there may be a chemical attack actually coming from the Russians. Blame the others for what you're about to do. Would that change everything? Is that a red line? Does that move us forward? What happens?
First of all, the U.S. has no chemical weapons that are staged for use anywhere near NATO or anywhere else for that matter. Secondly, yes, unfortunately, this sounds like the Russian playbook. Try and create a false flag operation if they're going to use chemical weapons. If they do so, we ought to recognize that the greatest thing we have is the truth. We ought to get out our cell phones. Our Ukrainian partners ought to have their cell phones. We ought to document as quickly as we can. Let's face it, if there is a use of chemical weapons, it is not going to be coming from the West. Who has used chemical weapons? The Russians in Syria, the Syrians in Syria, the Russians using chemical weapons to kill their own opponents. Alexander Navalny, the former leader of the opposition in Russia, is in a jail cell after having been poisoned by Russian chemical weapons. I think it's pretty clear who's going to pull out the chemical weapon card early on in this.
Admiral James Stavridis, thank you.